These are Dragon magazines from the late 70s and early 80s. And these are all that remains of a once vast collection. But as you get older, you move, boxes get lost, you go back and forth. Your parents move, boxes get lost. Well, D&D, he doesn't play that anymore. Looking through these reminds me of how much I loved this magazine. The thing about Dragon magazine was it was an incredible resource for new monsters, classes, adventure ideas. As I've said in other videos, I didn't play modules per se, but they were great ideas for traps and storylines and how to build and develop balanced encounters. So you can imagine my excitement when Matt Colville, who's one of the leading voices in terms of D&D, the 5th edition, he also has a real understanding of the lore of the earlier editions, announced this new magazine, Arcadia, that he was launching. So I went out, I got a copy online. Now I'm going to review it. Hello again, folks. KR King here, helping one and all homebrew their own D&D campaign. So, of course, the biggest time drain in terms of homebrewing your own D&D world is homebrewing your own D&D world. You can use the monsters and suggestions that are given in the manuals and supplements, but ultimately you've got to come up with storylines, you've got to come up with a map, all the cities, the lore, the history, the personages. It's a lot of work. So that's why clever GMs like moi are constantly on the search for materials and supplemental stuff to mine for their own campaign. And this is why Matt Colville's idea to sort of resurrect that magazine format was so exciting to me. And of course, I'm only going to show and talk about bits and pieces of these articles. I don't want to violate the copyright, and I want, if you get an idea of what I think about these, if it sounds like it's good for you, then go and get the magazine. You want to pay these people that created this material. Let me also say that in terms of pronouncing the authors' names and some of the, NPCs, apologies to anyone if I screw these up. Okay, so the first article in Arcadia is an adventure module called The Workshop Watches by Leon Barillaro. And to me, exploring the ramifications of sentient magic has always been a very fruitful device, in D&D, as sentient, machines are in all sorts of literature and movies. It's also a little tricky because there's some incoherence there. You always bump up against the sort of, the logical issues of, well, why did this sentience appear now? Why did it become, self-conscious at this moment? And then the suspension of disbelief, which is like, hey, it's just a game. We're just having fun. Here it is. So in the case of Leon's idea, basically you have a group of wizards who are funded by sort of a venture capitalist merchant of D&D to create a magic workshop using this assisted magic, which will then enhance their ability to produce items, sort of mass production. This merchant's kind of the Henry Ford of magic factories. But as always with artificial intelligence, when it comes to storytelling, it takes on a life of its own and trouble ensues. So in terms of the adventure hook or hooks that Leon provides and the timing, they do a great job in terms of putting the players in position just as things get out of hand. And this is important as a GM when you're creating something, the old screenwriting rule of get into the scene as late as possible, get out as early as possible, and always start the action right when we, the viewer, the players, etc., would be the most interested. So the AI that these wizards constructed, which is called SAM, which is an acronym for Structure for Assisted Magic, has destroyed these wizards and is now almost on the verge of creating an animatronic construct so that it can put its consciousness in and begin to move through the world. And right away, I have to say that Sam, as Leon has conceived of it, is not your stock, Terminator kind of destroy the sentient life forms. Instead, it wants to find out about sentience. It wants to move through the world. And so when the players confront it, it engages them, it asks them questions. It's not just openly hostile. And the way this personality is, as it's talking to them, I sort of think of, the HAL 9000 in 2001 Space Odyssey. Sam is going to greet them when they arrive at this mountaintop wizard's workshop. It's going to ask them questions. It's possibly going to react positively depending on what the players do. It isn't just out to destroy them. The other thing that Leon does is to lay out Sam's abilities very clearly in terms of its capabilities and what it might do depending on what the players do. And this is really helpful, again, as a GM, not just running this adventure, but just in general. When you have a clear sense of what your NPC, or in this case, your, construct intelligence, how it's going to react to different things, it seems as though it's real. Now, Leon also came up with this really interesting idea of the sort of magical interference. This place is suffused with magic, this consciousness, this assistance. So if the players ever cast a spell, there's a chance, it's a 1 out of 6, that something is going to happen. It can be as simple as just a warning or something more serious in terms of difficult terrain or different things. And it's just once the players start casting spells, they're going to realize, oh, this can happen. Another thing that I was glad I sort of expected this from Matt Colville's company, but the map is very high quality, and you get a JPEG with notations and then a blank one that you can use for virtual tabletop. I brought them into Fantasy Grounds and Roll20. They looked really good. To me, this is a top-notch adventure module. Very elegant, as I said, in its construction. Hats off to Leon. And again, it gives lessons. Even if you don't run modules per se, it really gives you some ideas of how to build them. So the second article by Gabe Hicks is a new subclass of sorcerers. And I'm going to say right at the outset, I've always had a weakness for sorcerers. I played them from when they were first introduced. I used to always play evocation wizards. I just, it was my sort of thought on the kind of wizard I wanted to be. So Gabe's idea here is to have a blood connection with a titan such that the sorcerer can twice per day call upon the magic energy of the titan, alter their forms such that they become much larger, they increase their armor class, their abilities are enhanced, they use their charisma modifier for things like striking and damage, at later levels, all sorts of, ability checks. You also get a bunch of primordial evocation spells. These are first level. And there's some cool ones. Blaze, where anyone within 5 feet of you is, takes fire damage. Quake, where you can cause a 15-foot radius to be shaking. Anyone who fails a save is prone, but it still is difficult terrain. The classic evocation, raw magic power, which I think sorcerers are into. Now, the thing about, new subclasses, players almost always love them. GMs are a little more hesitant, right? Especially if the players come up with something, they found on a Reddit forum or something, because you're worried about game balance. And I have not seen this sorcerer in any kind of gameplay setting, but I'm going to assume that Colville's team did play test this. Just looking at it on paper, I don't see anything that, differentiates it too much from the usual subclass, but you are going to have to see this. In the past, I tried to make my own subclasses. We'd have some special item, I had these chaos crystals that, controlled this power. We had chaos priests, and it was kind of a nightmare because it wasn't really play tested. It was too powerful. If you have a power that's on a one-off or a one-shot thing, it's not that big a deal. But when it comes to a whole campaign setting, you got to be careful introducing these subclasses. I think this one, like I said, on paper, I trust these guys. It should be okay. All right, so the third article in Arcadia, called Jumping on Mounted Combat by Willie Abiel, hopefully I got that pronunciation right, is in some ways my favorite because it presents rules on mounted combat. Anyone who's played this knows that this is something that's sorely lacking in 5e. And again, these rules are simple and elegant. When you have something that is simple but answers the questions that are being asked, elegance in terms of like a scientific theory, this is what you're always looking for, both as a GM and a player. I really like these rules. They take into effect the proficiency of the rider in terms of how the mount itself operates, which makes perfect sense to me. If you don't really know how to ride a horse, that horse is not going to react the same under someone, who's an expert horseman. And so the rider affects the mount's, skill checks, saving throws, its proficiency bonus. Really good idea. So Willie has created this bonus action that the rider uses to initiate an action by the mount. It's a bonus action on their turn. And then he has this really cool feature called vaulting attack, where the rider makes this dramatic dismount and attack. If they succeed on their check, they get advantage. But if they fail, they fall prone, right? It's a great, I just love this kind of thing. So the next thing Willie does is to provide a host of sample mounts. And what's interesting here is there's a change in terms of some of the stat blocks from the traditional, these mounts in the book. And what these do is reflect the relationship between the mount and the rider. So there's this really great feature where the mount gets temporary hit dice based on the level or challenge rating of the rider. And this reflects the sort of combat that higher level riders are going to get into, spell attacks or breath weapons or whatever. The mount is going to have to absorb that damage. So if you think about, in a historical sense, riders and mounts were both equally vulnerable, to swords or arrows or bullets or shell fragments. And they both took that damage, and, there were oftentimes riders were shot off their horses or their mounts were shot out from under them. But in a D&D setting, hit points are sort of an abstraction for a lot of different things in terms of leveling up and whatnot. So this temporary hit dice thing, I think, is a great mechanic to just give the mount a chance to survive this sort of combat. Especially something like a hippogriff, or a war horse that's not going to innately have a lot of hit dice. So the mounts that Willie provides as examples are really great. I especially like this giant toad mount. It has these extra features, power hop and tongue lashing. Again, really great. The hippogriff has a dive bomb attack that it can use while flying. And then on the ground, it treats difficult terrain that's not magical as ordinary terrain. And that is a tremendous feature. Willie also has two somewhat exotic mounts, the basilisk and owlbear. Now, in both cases in the 5th edition manual, it states that these can be tamed and ridden. It doesn't give you any rules to how this would happen. And obviously the, basilisk, if you're going to mount it, has to control its petrification gaze. And the owlbears have, let's say, an unpredictable temperament, to say the least. And this dovetails into a chart that Willie provides that shows the chance that a rider can tame a wild animal. Basically you have an animal handling check that starts with a DC 13, and then you add the animal's CR rating, and you get a whole variety of potential results, total hostility to total friendliness. Now, this is one of those things when I saw as a GM, I thought, well, I would make some modifications to this depending on the creature that someone's trying to tame. An owlbear has a CR of 3, which means somebody with a really good animal handling, let's say a ranger or druid, is probably going to make a really good roll if they're higher level. So what? They could just meet an owlbear and tame it and ride it around. I feel like the eggs are really valuable for owlbears. This indicates to me that, you have to sort of raise them from their chick cub, I guess. With a lot of wild animals, that's what you have to do. The other thing is, I feel like, training and taming something, even a domesticated animal like a dog, takes some time to train. Yes, I'm willing to believe with, druids being able to speak with animals, it's going to be easier for them to train. But again, just the fact if you just roll a dice and you can do it, I like the idea that maybe it takes a little longer, and certainly something that is undomesticated. Zebras are, I think to this day, still pretty much undomesticatable. And there are wild animals that it's really difficult. The owlbear is a classic example. It says that you can do it in the book. I'm willing to go along with it, but I don't know whether I would just have somebody just roll it. And by the way, that's the beauty of D&D. That's the beauty of these kind of magazines. You take what you like, you ignore what you don't, but you tweak stuff. All right, so the 4th article is, I think, called Uquivial the Recreant by Sadie Lowry. Again, I'm not sure if I'm getting this pronunciation right. So it's about the conflict between two archangels. The eponymous Uquivial and his nemesis Anahita. So Anahita has betrayed Uquivial in her lust for power that is greater than that she gains from the constancy of the noonday sun, quote unquote. And you always get this thing of, why was she so bored? What is it always about these archangels that they lust for more? It's an age-old thing. You don't necessarily need to explain it. And in fact, the story that Sadie lays out in terms of these two archangels is very compelling. It almost seems to me like it's, the beginnings of a really good fantasy novel. So basically, Anahita invites all these devils into this sacred building where they proceed to kill a whole bunch of planers and solars, and Uquivial gets blamed for it and banished to the material plane. So now Uquivial plots his revenge. Sadie gives some good ideas as to how you might incorporate Uquivial into your campaign, whether he's the, enemy, long-term villain in something. The players may meet him, right after he's been banished, so he's sort of weakened or something. They may meet Anahita, where she tricks them into pursuing him. And Sadie also lists various magic items and rituals that Colville needs to do in order to bring about the destruction of the material plane. And finally, Sadie does develop both Colville and Anahita in terms of their stat blocks, legendary actions. Obviously, they're very powerful, I think 23 and 24 CR respectively. And you could incorporate this whole conflict and everything into a campaign of much high-level characters. But the thing is, for me, in order to pull that off as a GM, you're going to have to incorporate a lot of material that's not really included in the article. At one point Sadie mentions, hey, if the players realize that Anahita, she's the true villain here, and they might attack her, but she has a host of infernal allies that will come between the players and her. Well, where are they? They're not really listed. There's also this elaborate contract that's held on the infernal plane. Sadie suggests the players could go to the infernal plane, fight these devils. She mentions this archfiend named Thalarazan who actually holds the contract. Can the players take this away from him? And you're like, what is this? What are the stats on this? It's the sort of thing that's not given. Now, if you love to play archangels and fiends and trips to hell and all this stuff, which I've done in the past, go for it. To me, this article, the other three were self-contained. Everything you needed was in the article, whereas this one took a little more work, a little more effort, and it was on this, super elevated plane in terms of the player characters. And that's the great tradition of the Dragon magazines. They had all sorts of materials. They had creatures that you were like, I am going to use this, and then they had some, not so much. And let me tell you, the mounted rules alone made this worth the $7 I spent on it. And then I got this great module as well, and the Sorcerer subclass, and even ideas about the Archangels. So for me, I can't wait to see the next issue. So as always, folks, if you like my content, please subscribe. Please leave some comments. I always answer them. But as always, what's most important is that you keep playing D&D and you tell somebody else about it.